You believe that ancient Greece invented democracy, philosophy, and Western art. And you believe all of that was born from the intellectual brilliance of an enlightened people. But what if I told you that this cradle of civilization was built on mountains of silver, ripped from the earth by slaves who lived only 4 years? And that this same civilization committed the first default in history not to a foreign bank, but to its own gods? Let me take you back to the year 483 before Christ. We're in Laurion, an arid region in the south of Attica, about 50 kilometers from Athens. Here, beneath the rocky Mediterranean soil, miners discovered something that would change the course of Western history. A vein of silver so rich it seemed inexhaustible. At that moment, no one imagined that this gleaming metal would become both the salvation and the death sentence of the greatest power of the ancient world. Athens wasn't exactly a powerhouse before that. It was just another Greek city-state, competing for space with rivals like Sparta, Corinth, and Aegina. But when the silver began pouring from Laurion, everything changed. The statesman Themistocles had a vision. Instead of distributing that wealth among the citizens, as was customary, he convinced the Athenian assembly to do something radical. Build 200 triremes, the most advanced warships of their time. It was a monumental gamble. And it worked. In 480 before Christ, when the Persian Emperor Xerxes invaded Greece with a fleet said to darken the sea, it was those triremes, financed by Laurion silver, that defeated the Persians at the naval battle of Salamis. That day, in the churning waters between Athens and the island of Salamis, silver became power, and Athens became an empire. But that victory hid a dark secret. Because while Athenian citizens debated philosophy in the agora and watched Aeschylus's tragedies in the theater, 20,000 slaves descended daily into more than 2,000 underground galleries in Laurion. There, in suffocating darkness, they worked in shifts that knew neither day nor night. Production reached 1 million ounces of silver per year, and each slave had a life expectancy of only 4 years. Hunger, disease, cave-ins, and punishment ensured that this labor army never grew old. The math was simple and brutal. A slave cost between 150 and 200 drachmas. Rented to mine contractors, he generated a profit of 1 obol per day for the owner. That meant an annual return of 30%, far higher than money lending. The Athenian democracy, the one that paid its citizens to participate in assemblies and courts, that allowed even the poorest to have a political voice, literally rested on piles of enslaved bodies. And the silver kept flowing. It was minted into tetradrachms, the coins bearing the iconic owl of Athena that circulated throughout the Mediterranean. With that money, Athens financed the construction of the Parthenon, the Propylaea, and the Temple of Athena Nike. It paid for Phidias's sculptures that still leave us speechless today. It financed Sophocles, Euripides, and Socrates' conversations on the city's streets. The so-called century of Pericles was, in truth, the century of silver. But here's the first crack in the narrative. Athens didn't directly exploit the mines. The state leased the extraction rights to private entrepreneurs who paid exorbitant sums. One preserved contract mentions 9,000 drachmas for just 3 years of operation. These entrepreneurs, in turn, rented or purchased slaves, and roughly 80 to 90% of their capital was invested in disposable human flesh. The Athenian state received its taxes, kept its hands clean, and celebrated its enlightened democracy. And then came the trap no one saw coming. Because silver, no matter how abundant it seemed, wasn't infinite. An Athenian democracy, addicted to that flow of precious metal, had built a spending machine that couldn't stop. Monumental temples, ever larger naval fleets, payments to citizens, religious festivals, military expeditions, all depended on the silver flowing from southern Attica. But what happens when an entire civilization bets its future on a finite resource and suddenly loses access to it? The answer lies in the first default in history. And believe me, it was far more dramatic than any modern financial crisis you've ever heard of. 431 before Christ. The rivalry between Athens and Sparta, which had been intensifying for decades, finally erupted into the Peloponnesian War. On one side, Athens and its maritime empire, sustained by the Delian League, an alliance that, let's be honest, was more like a refined extortion system, where city-states paid tribute under the threat of naval invasion. On the other side, Sparta and its land-based allies, with an austere economy built on agriculture and the slavery of the helots. Here in Athens, on the Acropolis overlooking the city, the treasury of the Delian League had been transferred in 454 before Christ. 9,700 talents in silver and gold, stored inside the Parthenon, a fortune equivalent to billions of dollars today. It was supposedly the Allies' common fund. In practice, it was Athens's personal vault. The war began with Athenian optimism. After all, they had the fleet, the silver from Laurion, and the tribute from their allies. But prolonged wars are wealth-devouring machines. Each trireme required 200 rowers who demanded constant pay. Each military expedition cost fortunes. The long walls connecting Athens to the port of Piraeus required maintenance and defense. And the allies, sensing Athenian weakness, began rebelling, cutting off the flow of tribute. That's when Athens did something unprecedented in history. The assembly, meeting on the slope of the Acropolis, authorized loans from the treasury of Athena. These weren't ordinary loans, they were loans of sacred money belonging to the city's patron goddess. Picture the scene. Priests and treasurers opening the Parthenon's doors, the temple built precisely with Laurian silver, and hauling out sacks of coins to fund the war. Each loan was recorded on marble steles, with interest initially set at 6% per year, later reduced to 1.5%. But Athens didn't stop there. 16 smaller temples across Attica were also called upon to lend to the state. Epigraphic records show loans ranging from 20 drachmas to over 5 talents, each with its own interest. One specific loan of 18 talents and 3,000 drachmas generated 4,173 drachmas in interest. The city was literally borrowing money from its own gods to keep fighting. And then came the fatal blow. Year 413 before Christ. The Spartans, led by General Agis, occupied a fortress called Decelia just 22 kilometers north of Athens. It seemed like a simple military maneuver, but Decelia sat right on the route between Athens and Laurion. Suddenly, the city's main source of silver, the mines that had sustained its empire for 70 years, was cut off. The slaves fled, more than 20,000 of them, according to Thucydides. Production stopped. The river of silver ran dry. Imagine the irony. Athens, which had defeated the greatest empire of the ancient world thanks to Laurion's silver, was now cut off from that same source of power. Revenues plummeted. Imagine the irony. Athens, which had defeated the greatest empire of the ancient world thanks to Laurion's silver, was now cut off from that same source of power. Revenues plummeted. Athens tried everything. It instituted the eisphora, a direct property tax on wealthy citizens, almost unprecedented, since the city had always relied on indirect taxes and external tributes. It imposed liturgies, obligations, where the richest citizens funded festivals, plays, or worships. It increased tributes on remaining allies, which only fueled more rebellions. Nothing worked, and we arrive at the year 423 before Christ. Athens' debt to Athena's treasury had reached 7,000 talents. To put that in perspective, at the start of the war, the entire treasury held about 6,000 talents. Athens owed more to its own gods than the total wealth it had accumulated over decades of empire, and there was no possible way to repay it. Here, on the Acropolis, where the Parthenon still gleamed with its polychrome sculptures, where marble steles recorded every divine loan, Athens simply stopped paying. There was no formal announcement, no assembly vote declaring default. The city just stopped. Interest ceased to be paid. The principal was never returned. The first sovereign default in history wasn't made to greedy bankers or rival nations. It was made to the very gods who had protected the city for centuries. And the irony doesn't end there, because this ancient bankruptcy reveals something unsettling about every modern one. That financial collapse is never just about numbers. It's always about the illusion that prosperity can last forever. 404 before Christ. Athens surrenders. The fleet is destroyed. The long walls are torn down to the sound of flutes, the Spartans celebrating the end of the Athenian Empire. The city that had dominated the Aegean for nearly a century was reduced to a second-rate power. Sparta imposed an oligarchic government, the so-called 30 tyrants who plunged Athens into terror and civil war. But the story doesn't end there. In 400 before Christ, democracy was restored, and with it, an extraordinary eisphora, a massive property tax to finally settle the remaining war debts. Athenian society was devastated. The fields of Attica had been repeatedly burned during the war. Thousands of citizens were dead. The slave population had fled, and the mines of Laurion remained inaccessible and exhausted. There was one last attempt to revive the old dream. In 338 before Christ, under the statesman Lycurgus, Athens tried to reactivate the Laurion mines to finance resistance against Philip II of Macedon advancing from the north to conquer all of Greece. But it was too late. New deposits had been discovered in Thrace and Macedon itself. Laurion was obsolete technologically and geologically spent. And then, in 103 before Christ, came the final epilogue. A massive slave revolt in the mines, inspired by the Great Slave Uprisings, shaking the Mediterranean world, ended mining for good. The 2,000 galleries were abandoned. They would remain that way until the 19th century, when French engineers returned to explore them, finding only flooded tunnels and skeletons of ancient workers. But here's the question that should keep us up at night. What really caused Athens' bankruptcy? Was it the Peloponnesian War? The loss of access to Laurion? The rebellion of allies? The answer is simpler and scarier. It was the belief that prosperity, based on a finite resource, could last forever. Athens built an entire economic machine dependent on silver, mined by disposable slaves from pits that would inevitably run out. It built expensive democratic institutions that required constant funding. It built a maritime empire that bred resentment and rebellion. And when the flow of silver stopped, the whole structure collapsed like a house of cards. Look around you today. How many modern economies depend on oil, natural gas, or rare minerals? How many wealthy nations of the 21st century base their prosperity on resources that, by definition, are not renewable? How many governments take on debt assuming perpetual growth, eternal revenue streams, booms that will never end? The bankruptcy of Athens wasn't an anomaly. It was the prototype. It was the first in a long series of financial collapses caused by the same illusion. The belief that we can build entire civilizations on temporary foundations and expect them to last forever. The first default in history isn't a relic of the past, it's a warning from the future, and we're all, collectively, choosing to ignore it.